and welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am reading through some of America's earliest best-selling novels as reported by The Bookman, a literary magazine of the 1890s. Today's book is The Marriage of William Ashe by Mrs. Humphry Ward, published 1905. Humphry was her husband, her first name was Mary, but Humphry was the name she published by. Mrs. Ward was a deeply serious woman. Practically everything I found that someone wrote about her made sure to note how she lacked humor or wit or personal charm, that she was stiff and it bored her to unbend. But she was, at least, very invested in the education of young people and of women, even women in university settings. These were causes that she often took on, so that's nice. But Mrs. Ward was also a staunch anti-suffragette. She did not think that women belonged in politics, at least higher-tier politics like Parliament. Unlike some anti-suffragettes, she was not wholly against women participating in local government, but still. As far as I can tell, she was an author broadly respected. She was pretty successful, with some regular criticisms. So, with our scene set, William Ashe is known as, quote, one of the idlest young men alive, end quote. He is the only still living child of Lord and Lady Tranmere, and while he technically works in politics, the biggest thing he has accomplished in the last 8 years is that, quote, he has grown uncommonly handsome, end quote. He makes speeches that he hopes his mother doesn't read about in the papers because he doesn't actually believe anything that he's saying. He's just trying to play the game. Quote, he saw himself often as an actor among actors, but the play was good, all the same, end quote. He enjoys the pursuit of a goal, even if he thinks it's sort of meaningless. The strange part is that in private, he's actually a very diligent, thoughtful, studious man. His study is lined wall-to-wall in books, which, quote, when opened, would have been found to contain notes and underlinings in a somewhat reckless and destructive abundance, end quote. But, quote, to have the reputation of an idler and be in truth a plodding and unwearied student pleased him. To avow an enthusiasm or an affection generally seemed to him an indelicacy, end quote. This sounds very English. Ashe has recently come home to London to take on a position in Parliament as Under-Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and since his father is getting very ill, more of the family estates and income are becoming his responsibility. And as their only child, it's really about time he got married, something he has never really shown an interest in. The most obvious candidate is his cousin Mary, who is, quote, very nice, quite sweet-tempered and intelligent. She looked well, moved well, would fill the position admirably, end quote. They've been close since childhood, and yet something just doesn't quite click. But then he meets another girl, Kitty Bristol, 18 years old, recently returned from her schooling at a convent in France. Dark eyes, fair hair, very pretty, quote, the figure undeveloped, the feet and hands extremely small, end quote. She has the airs of a princess, except for her incessant chattering. He is fascinated by her wild enthusiasm and utter lack of decorum. She just doesn't have the proper reserved politeness expected of a girl in high society. Now, I said she was 18. Ashe is like 30. I'm not going to harp on that, but the book certainly will. She is constantly being referred to as so young, this poor, naive child, by Ashe especially, and even as years will pass, spoilers, it's brought up multiple times that she looks even younger. Even when she's experiencing serious despair, we are reminded that, quote, she might have been a child of 17, grieving over the death of her goldfinch, end quote, and it's just a lot. You know what else is a lot? The number of times that Ashe is flirting with a girl who is referred to as his cousin. Remember, there's his actual cousin, who he's thinking about marrying, but he and Kitty also decide that they should just be cousins, even though they're not, and they really just mean friends. And I could get over that. People married their cousins, it's a thing. But he also has a conversation with both Cousin Mary and Cousin Kitty that is described as elder brotherly, and that is just a bridge too far. Ashe and Kitty are both invited, among other guests, to stay at the estate of Kitty's aunt, the Lady Grosville, and Kitty is basically her aunt's worst nightmare. Lady Grosville, quote, seemed to suggest all those aspects of the English Sunday for which he, Ashe, had a most secret dislike. Its Pharisaism and dullness and heavy meals, end quote. She's stuffy, traditional, and proper. Meanwhile, Kitty tries to bring her barking, biting, shoe-eating terrier puppy to sit on her knee at the dinner table. She wears flouncy dresses in the afternoon when such frivolity should clearly be reserved for the evening alone. She takes breakfast in bed on a Sunday, and then tries to play piano on Sunday, and then plays billiards on Sunday. Even Ashe occasionally finds her distasteful. She certainly knows how to jam her foot in her mouth, but her eccentricity is also what draws him to her. She's clever and passionate. She breaks into reenactments of French theater on a whim in the middle of a conversation. She's young. She just needs some smoothing around the edges. And it's not entirely her fault. How could she have turned into a respectable young woman with the kind of mother that she had? Ashe learns more about Kitty's family history from her uncle one night, when Lord Grosville, quote, no longer either hungry for his dinner or worried by his responsibilities as host, fell upon his wife's family and, as though he had been the manager of a puppet show, unpacked the whole box of them for Ashe's entertainment, end quote. Kitty has one older half-sister, who she's never met, named Alice, from their father's first marriage. Alice was raised away from him. He hated her mother all the way until she died because she never gave him a son. But then he remarried when Alice was 17, and suddenly Lord Blackwater wanted to be a family again. Alice goes to he and his wife in Paris, and her beautiful cosmopolitan stepmother welcomes her with open arms, dresses her in finery, and introduces her to society. Before long, Alice gets married to a man she probably shouldn't, but they seem happy. They have a son together. They're all living in glamorous splendor with her family by the grace of Alice's money. See, her mother was wealthy, and this fortune was not left in Lord Blackwater's control on her death, but Alice's. And we learn that it's likely Alice's husband was actually a lover of her stepmother's, and he just married her to take control of her money for his lover, the stepmother's benefit. This stepmother is Kitty's mother. Eventually, Lord Blackwater dies. Kitty's mom runs off to marry another old rich guy who has since also died, and Alice fell into poverty, nursing a sick husband who himself died just last year, with their 14-year-old son following 3 months after that. And at the end of hearing of this messy tragedy, the first thing that Ashe says is, "Poor Kitty." Because how will she manage with a mother like that? This isn't all common knowledge, but rumors are spreading, and, quote, what sort of man could safely take the risk of marrying her with that mother in the background, end quote. Kitty herself doesn't know the details of her family history, but she knows that people dislike her because they dislike her mother. Quote, I am played with and treated as a baby. There is something horrible the matter, and no one trusts me. Everyone keeps me in the dark, end quote. And she has to bear all of this hardship for a person she barely knows, who she doesn't even think that she loves. She spent all her teenage years at that convent, and in her childhood, she went through periods where she was hideously spoiled and shown off like a prop, followed by days straight of being completely ignored and neglected. Her mother, as she says, doesn't like children. Kitty says to Ashe once, quote, do you know why I shall never be happy? It's because I have such a bad temper. I'm mad sometimes, quite mad, with pride, I suppose, and vanity, end quote. A doctor told her that she would probably go mad once when she was 14, quote, Maman used to throw this at me when she was cross with me, end quote. Kitty just has an overwhelming desire, quote, to be the first, the best, the most distinguished, to be envied and pointed at, obeyed when I lift my finger, and then to come to some great, glorious, tragic end, end quote. And hearing all of this, Ashe is flooded with a desire to save her. From her background and her mother and her own impulsivity, to capture her before she is swept up by a bad man who might ruin her. Quote, he scarcely knew her. His mother, his family, would think it madness. No doubt it was madness. His pulse quickened as he thought of the development of this beauty, the ripening of this intelligence, and if she married him, he vowed to himself proudly that she would find him no tyrant. Many a man might marry her who would then fight her and try to break her. With him she would have freedom, whatever it might cost, end quote. He could never tame her, but love will always bring her back to him, no matter where her wild fancies might carry her. So he proposes marriage, and she tells him, quote, you must listen. I have a wicked, odious, ungovernable temper. I should make you miserable. Not at all, said Ashe. I should take it very calmly. I am made that way. And then, I don't know how to put it, but I have fancies, overpowering fancies, and I must follow them. I can't help it. It is my head, she tapped her forehead lightly, that seems on fire. Ashe at last slipped an arm round her. But it is your heart you will give me, end quote. She cries and declares that she adores him, end quote. Their faces met. Ashe tasted a moment of rapture, and he knew himself free at last of the great company of poets and lovers, end quote. Their first year of marriage is one of excitement and happiness. And then they have a son, Henry, and he is born with a visibly deformed, paralyzed foot, which sends Kitty spiraling into hopeless misery. Some weeks she fawns over him remorsefully, some weeks she neglects him entirely, quote, settling after a while into a petulant melancholy for which the baby's defect seemed but an inadequate cause, end quote. I say neglect. Recall they are rich. She isn't personally responsible for his caretaking, but still. Kitty goes abroad to recover and comes back better, but changed. Quote, the first exquisite softness of the expanding life was gone. Things harder, stranger, seemed now and then to come to the surface like wreckage in a summer sea, end quote. Her spending is extravagant and her behavior as audacious as ever. She pretends to faint while at the theater to get the attention of a prince. She orders an outrageously expensive dress for a costume party that is positively dripping with more diamonds than they can really afford. Because William, quote, we must behave like other people, end quote. This dress features very scandalous sandals, which she is talked into wearing over white silk stockings. Quote, you would have preferred ankles au naturel? I don't think you'd have been admitted. Shouldn't I? And so few people have feet they can show, end quote. Oh my goodness, her ankles, what a harlot. She is also constantly late to her own social events, if she remembers that she's hosting them at all. And while she is charming and young and fascinating enough that people tend to forgive her behavior, quote, a certain indulgence was wearing out, and what had been amusement was passing into criticism, end quote, by the time their marriage is 3 years old. And Ashe doesn't do anything. He wouldn't have married her if he wasn't willing to let her have her own way. Even when she starts a feud with the Prime Minister and his wife so severe that, as a subordinate of the Prime Minister, Ashe is nearly backed into a corner where he will have to resign from his job. Even still, he doesn't lose his temper, he doesn't ask her not to, he just says, okay, if that's what you want to do, dear, lights a cigarette and steps outside. Under the surface, though, her constant emotional turmoil is starting to wear on him. She will be detached and cold during the day, and then cling to him, sobbing herself into exhaustion through the night, and a part of him is getting tired. And then Geoffrey Cliff comes back to London. Cliff is an old friend of Ashe's, now turned nemesis. He's a poet, a journalist, a politician. He and Ashe engage in verbal sparring matches across newspaper articles, speeches, and dinner tables. And Kitty becomes very captivated by him. He's not a good man. He has, quote, the eyes of a man self-centered, self-absorbed. There was no chivalrous softness in them, no consideration, end quote. But he's intense and mysterious, and his poetry is filled with tragic passion, offering glimpses into a wild love he'd had for a Frenchwoman who is now rumored to be dead as a result of their relationship. Tormented by Cliff and his jealousy and beastly behavior, and overwhelmed by her own self-scorn. I'm pretty sure it's left very ambiguous how she died. Once it's stated that Cliff killed her, but I don't think that's meant literally. Whether she was responsible or the emotions just kinda killed her, I don't know. But there's an implication of poor behavior on Cliff's part. But Kitty doesn't care. She is just enthralled by the raw emotion of it all. At a luncheon, she tells him, quote, don't you think that jealousy will soon be as dead as saying your prayers and going to church? I never met anybody who cared enough to be jealous. It's like the people who think they could act or sing if only they had the chance. I choose to think I could feel, and of course I couldn't. We've lost the power. All the old, horrible, splendid things are dead and done with, end quote. She gives him a glimpse of inner melancholy that he is intrigued by, but his real attentions lately have been towards Mary Lister, Ashe's cousin that he kind of almost married. She's 30 now and prettier than ever, but still unwed. And rich, which Cliff is in need of. Kitty has hated Mary from the literal moment she laid eyes on her. And as Cliff pursues Mary, she finds herself thinking that Mary isn't worthy enough for him. And then she overhears Mary shit-talking her at a party, calling her a silly embarrassment that's going to ruin Ashe's career, and Kitty is flooded with white-hot, primal rage. Over the next 2 months, her and Cliff are joined at the hip. They will not attend events if they are not invited together. They go boating on the river alone while he reads her French poetry. She starts calling him by his first name. Ashe views this as an annoyance, but also sees Kitty less as a person and more as a fairy creature. She can't be controlled or expected to act rationally. Opposition will just make her dig her heels in. Better just wait this out. But for the first time in their relationship, he starts losing his temper. They're bickering over trivial things. Kitty is aware that she's doing something wrong. She's hurting the husband that she loves, both emotionally and in his career, but she just can't stop. And then, one night, Kitty doesn't come home after a dinner with friends. Ashe tries not to panic, but by dawn, she still hasn't appeared. He thinks maybe there was trouble with the coach or a train, but then he gets a message that the dinner was cancelled because someone got sick. So where is his wife? And then she enters the room, quote, trembling, her little face haggard and white. William, I have done nothing wrong, nothing. William, look at me. He sternly put out his hand, protecting himself. Where have you been? He said in a low voice, and with whom? Kitty fell into a chair and burst into wild tears, end quote. When the dinner got cancelled, she decided to go boating with Cliff instead. And that evening, he went mad. Cliff, quote, intoxicated by the long day of intimacy, by Kitty's beauty and Kitty's folly, aware that parting was near at hand, had suddenly assumed the language of the lover, end quote. He was almost harsh about it, quote, he had taken no particular pains to flatter her. It was plain that he thought she had treated her husband badly, end quote, and yet still he asked her to have the courage to follow where passion leads, break from Ashe and join with him instead. Kitty, horrified and insulted, ran away, but it was too late to catch a train home until morning. This does sound like an excuse for why she might have been out with a man all night, but I do think she is telling the truth. She says that Ashe should send her away before she ruins his life, but he is actually very forgiving. Quote, roughly, impetuously, he gathered her in his arms and kissed her, as though he would once more reknit and reconsecrate the bond between them, end quote. And Kitty, for the first time, becomes fully aware that Ashe is like a whole person. Whereas before, quote, her passionate self-love instinctively, unconsciously, had made of his life the appendage of hers, end quote. She says that she loathes Cliff, quote, if I could pile the whole world between him and me, I would, but if he were sitting there, end quote, there's just something wrong with her, a desperation for something, anything, as long as it's more, no matter the cost. And then she starts hand-feeding him sandwiches, quote, like some small mother bird, end quote. I don't know why that's happening. They're the little, tea time sandwiches, fairly bite-sized, not, a whole honkin' foot long, but it was still distractingly random. I guess it's kinda cute. They decide it's for the best if they relocate to a family house out in the country, keep Kitty a little more out of the way and further from trouble. It doesn't exactly calm her down. Over several months, she jumps wildly from one new passion to another, desperately trying to find something to do with her time. But she is not causing tangible harm anymore. She does start another flirtation, this time with a very young man who Ashe thinks is clearly in love with her, but Ashe really doesn't mind. Quote, if Kitty liked to flirt with babes, it was her affair, not his, end quote. She even agrees to smooth over her feud with the Prime Minister, and Ashe actually starts advancing in politics again. Passionately, now, he can't hide that he cares for it anymore. And he finally gets a promotion to Home Secretary that he's been hoping for, and there are even whispers that maybe one day he could even rise as high as Prime Minister. Not everything is better, though. Their son Henry is getting worse. Quote, during the last 6 months, the child had shown signs of brain mischief, a curious apathy, broken now and then by fits of temper. The doctors were not encouraging, end quote. Kitty once sits with him in the garden and tries to get him to play with a new toy, quote, but the child looked at her with blank and glassy eyes, and the toy fell from his hand. He hardly knows me, said Kitty in a low voice of misery as she clasped her hands round the baby of 3 and looked into his face as though she would drag from it some sign of mind and recognition. But the blue eyes betrayed no glimmer of response, end quote, and Kitty herself is looking a bit gaunt, concerningly thin. A friend of theirs, looking at her once, is struck by, quote, the sudden and painful impression of something undermined, something consumed from within, end quote. Her main pastime lately, top secret even from her dear husband, has been the writing of a novel. She works on it while he's gone, or in the dead of night, or out in the woods, and it's different, she says, from most books. Quote, mine's not the proper thing. Mine's real people, real things that happened, just with the names altered. Of course, I've made a kind of story out of it, but you'd have to be a great fool not to guess, end quote. She allows one friend to read it. It paints a very flattering picture of Ashe and an unflattering one of everyone else. Ashe is the center of everything, and, quote, of course, all unknown to the author, the fool of the piece. Political indiscretion, also, of the most startling kind, scandals of the day, material, as far as he could see, for a dozen libel actions, and with it all, much fantastic ability, flashes of wit and romance, enough to give the book wings beyond its first personal audience, enough, in fact, to secure to all its scandalous matter the widest possible chance of fame, end quote. Kitty knows that Ashe won't approve, that's why she hasn't told him, but surely, of course, he'll forgive her. She'll get him to laugh about it. It's clever, it's funny. She asks the friend to take it to a publisher for her. It'll be done anonymously, of course, not that it will matter. Then things start getting worse. The Prime Minister comes for a visit, and she really intends to behave, and then he annoys her, and she stops trying, and insults him directly to his face again. Tensions in the house are spiraling upward. Kitty's need for attention is at an all-time high. And in one of her fits of theatrics, she ends up outside, standing on an empty pedestal, waving a lamp dramatically over her head, making a speech to the crowd in the third person that, quote, "She herself hasn't been happy, and she's afraid she hasn't been good. N'importe, it's all done and finished. The play is over, and the lights go out." The bright figure on the pedestal wavered one moment, and it seemed as though the lamp must descend crashing upon the head and neck and the white dress beneath it. The next it had fallen from Kitty's hand, fallen away from her, wide and safe, into the depths of the garden below. A flash of wild light rose from the burning oil and from the dry shrubs amid which it fell. Kitty, meanwhile, swayed and dropped, heavily unconscious, into William Ashe's arms. Kitty barely recovered life and sense during the night that followed, and while she was still unconscious, her boy passed away. The poor babe, all ignorant of the straits in which his mother lay, was seized with convulsions in the dawn, and gave up his frail life gathered to his father's breast. End quote. Yes, that was very sudden. She's got that Victorian lady disease. Too much excitement just sort of knocks him over. Quote, "The doctors had explained her illness as nervous collapse, pointing back to a long preceding period of overstrain and excitement." End quote. The good thing is, her illness and the death of their child do a wonderful job in smoothing out all of the feathers Kitty had just been ruffling. Even the Prime Minister has great sympathy. When a good number of weeks had passed and she is able to travel, she and Ashe go to Venice for some rest and recovery. These people think that every problem can be solved by going abroad, and you know what? I'm jealous. There are moments in Venice where Kitty actually seems happy, and then she'll blurt out that it would have been better if she'd died when their son did, and then act like nothing ever happened. And then Alice. Do you remember Alice? I barely do. She's Kitty's half-sister that we learned about. Kitty actually met her once in person shortly before Ashe proposed, and it was very dramatic. Kitty came away sobbing because Alice hated her and said that she was swearing revenge on Kitty's mother and was going to drive her out of London. And I didn't mention any of this at the time because nothing came of it. Alice was set up like she was going to be so important, and then she disappeared for 300 pages. She didn't have to drive Kitty's mom out of London, because Ashe did that when they married. He set up an allowance and told her to go off to the continent somewhere, which he did because of her reputation, which was worsened by rumors that Alice was spreading, I guess, but that's a much subtler revenge than I was expecting. Anyway, Alice now lives quite close to Venice. She runs a school where women and girls learn the craft of lace making. She's taken in 2 orphans to care for. Kitty runs into her by happenstance. That is the theme of her time in Venice, by the way. At least half a dozen times she'll just bump into someone she knows in this city that none of them live in. It got really funny, actually. But while last time Alice hated her, now she is strangely kind. She commiserates over their shared loss of their sons and tells her, quote, "If you are ever in trouble, if you ever want me, send for me," end quote. And it feels like Alice is supposed to be the anti-Kitty. Both of them share their father's bad blood. Alice says in her first scene that they are both like him and they should never have been born. But Alice never actually displays this badness. She is demure and kind and charitable and Catholic. Kitty has thought recently that she wishes she were still religious, that it might provide something that could finally control her, but she can't be because Ashe is a serious skeptic, and, quote, "How would she ever maintain her faith against William who knew so much more than she," end quote. We'll circle back to this book and its thoughts on religion, but for now, back to Kitty's bad decisions. It's been 3 months since she sent off her novel for publication, and it's now very close to release. One day, she walks into their room and finds Ashe with an open package containing a handful of books, all of the same shape and size. Some advance copies of her soon-to-be novel. Kitty launches into apologies, begs him not to be angry, says she realized how upset he would be, and did, honestly, try to get the publisher to cancel everything, which she did, but much too late. Thousands of copies have already been ordered by booksellers, it's been sent to reviewers, it's being hyped by the newspapers. Ashe, with an unnerving, cold sort of calm, says that he's getting on a train tomorrow to go home and submit his resignation. Kitty tries to argue that he's being rash, that she was only trying to help him, but, quote, "You imagined that sketch of Lord Parham," he struck the open page, "a sketch written by my wife describing my official chief when he was my guest under my own roof, with all sorts of details of the most intimate and offensive kind, mocking his speech, his manners, his little personal ways, charging him with being the corrupt tool of Lady Parham, disloyal to his colleagues, a man not to be trusted. You actually supposed that you could write and publish that without making it impossible for your husband to remain a colleague of the man you had treated in such a way. Kitty, you are not a stupid woman," end quote. Somehow, the most galling and humiliating part of it all is that she wrote it trying so blatantly to glorify him. Quote, "Your taste, Kitty, where was your taste? That a wife should praise a husband in public." In his eyes she had shown herself not only reckless and treacherous, but indelicate, vulgar, and capable of besmirching the most sacred and intimate of relations, end quote. He's going to do whatever he can, buy every copy he can find, beg the newspapers to help cover it up, but there's no way he can catch everything. He does try to be begrudgingly optimistic. This isn't the end of the world. Losing his job just means they can travel more. He can spend more time reading for leisure, because remember, this isn't a normal man with a normal job that he actually needs to support himself. This is a rich boy sitting on a massive family estate. Politics is effectively a life-consuming hobby. Kitty is distraught, though, that he wants her to stay in Venice while he goes home alone. You'd think she was begging him not to leave their marriage, she is so upset, but he gives her a kiss, against her will, and then he goes. Re-enter Geoffrey Cliff, Kitty's old poet-lover. Following their incident, he was quietly pushed out of London by some of his own family. Word is he ended up in Bosnia, reporting on a revolution happening there, and maybe even fighting himself with the rebels against the Turks. But right now there's a lull in the fighting, and Cliff has been spotted in Venice, often accompanied by an actress, the Mademoiselle Ricci, quote, "a flamboyant lady, noisy, rude, and false. It could only be said on the other side that she was handsome, for those who admired that kind of thing, and famous, more or less," end quote. Kitty has almost run into Cliff, but has genuinely done her best to avoid him. But now, in Ashe's absence, as she walks along the shore, daydreaming about being drowned or poisoned, quote, "lying somewhere white and cold on a bed where William might see and forgive her," end quote, who does she run into but Geoffrey Cliff? She could walk right past him, but he is concerned. She looks terrible and tired and like she's in trouble. He begs, quote, "Don't be afraid of me. Look at me. Trust me. My heart has grown, Kitty, since you knew me last. It has taken into itself so many griefs, so many deaths. Tell me your griefs, poor child, tell me." He stooped and kissed her hands, most tenderly, most gravely. Tears rushed into her eyes. Bending towards him, she began to pour out, first brokenly, then in a torrent, the wretched, incoherent story, end quote. And thus their affair begins anew. They go to churches and galleries together, or spend long days out on the water. Mary, Ashe's cousin and Cliff's almost fiancée for a minute there, is also in town, and she starts getting hopeful that maybe Ashe's marriage will finally fall apart completely, and she and him could be together. Eventually, Cliff is gripped with the same reckless, sudden passion that has already ruined their lives once before, and he asks her to run away with him when he goes back to Bosnia. He's only in Venice to collect money and supplies and men to support the revolution, and she could come with him too. Quote, "Ashe cramps you. He blames you. You blame yourself. It makes you miserable. It wastes life. I accept your nature. I don't ask you to be anything else than yourself, your wild, vain, adorable self, end quote. He says his time with the rebels, dancing with death, witnessing true suffering, surrounded by the wild nature of the mountains and forests, the tragedy, the cold, the fatigue, it's all made him a better, more selfless man. And she, too, could be forged anew. She would be swept out of herself by the great forces of the world which create and destroy. It would heal her very soul. It does, for a moment, stir the wild passions lurking inside her, but, quote, of course, that's all romantic nonsense. You've perhaps forgotten that I am one of the women who don't stir without their maid, end quote. Besides, they'd probably get tired of each other in a week. But he asks that she have the courage to try. He thinks her weakness is only born of her easy life, that roughness will breed strength she doesn't know she has. He wants to see what she could become, given the chance, but she is uncertain. Back in London, Ashe's situation is not as bad as he'd feared. Every copy of the book is snatched from stores, and the newspapers are all very cooperative. Quote, in general, a far more complete hushing up had been attained than Ashe had ever imagined possible, end quote. There is gossip, but also sympathy, given the recent grief in the family. The Prime Minister himself asked Ashe not to resign. But then he receives a letter from Kitty where she admits to everything. And again, she pushes away the blame. Yes, it was wrong, but she just can't control herself. No one could. And besides, Ashe doesn't love her like he used to. He left her to go back to London to clean up her mess with every intention of seeing her again, but sure. Of course, it's what she deserves, but she just can't bear it. If she came home, he would try to be kind to her and good, and it would just make her want to die. She's not even sure if she loves Cliff, but he is captivating, quote, and I feel that I could die, if not for him, at least with him, and he is not unlikely to die in some heroic way, end quote. So she will go with him to Bosnia, pass herself off as his wife, and work as a nurse in some terrible hospital. If Ashe cared about her more, she would feel so terribly guilty doing this to him, but he won't. Her place in his life has already been taken by politics. Ashe sends a letter back pleading her not to, asking, has he ever failed her? Has he ever been harsh? If he was, please forgive him. Quote, come home, you poor child, and you shall hear no reproaches from me. Kitty, the grass is not yet green on our child's grave. Kitty, have you no heart and no conscience? Will you dig between us the gulf which is irreparable, across which your hand and mine can never touch each other any more? I cannot and I will not believe it. Come back to me, come back, end quote. Kitty reads this letter sobbing and feels a great tension give way. Images flood her mind of peace and reunion, and then, I'm gonna be honest, I got a little bit confused. There's a line that Kitty, quote, found ink and paper and began to write, end quote, immediately followed by the words, from Lady Tranmore to William Ashe, a letter to him from his mother. And I was convinced that Kitty had written this letter pretending to be her mother-in-law. It says she sat down to write, and then we are immediately shown a letter. The contents are basically that Kitty has gone to Verona, and she doesn't want anyone to know where she is. She needs time to think, but it's a clear sign that she may be backing down from going with Cliff. Lady Tranmore expresses concern, though, that she told Cousin Mary what Kitty is doing, and she really shouldn't have, because the more people know, the more risk that Cliff may find out where she is. And on one hand, it doesn't make any sense for Kitty to have written this letter. She has nothing to gain except maybe sympathy if she was planning to go with Cliff but wanted people to think that she nearly backed down, setting up Lady Tranmore and Mary to take the fall for Cliff finding out where she went if she was actually the one who told him. But that's weak and confusing, and Ashe probably knows his mother's handwriting and could easily find out, even by accident, that she hadn't written this letter. But my conviction was fueled by the fact that this letter talks very weirdly about Mary, who Lady Tranmore has always loved like family, but who Kitty hates. It says that lately Mary has grown very hard and bitter. She has many weaknesses, but she's so loyal to us. I just couldn't help telling her, but I'm sure she wouldn't say anything. The final paragraph of the letter is about how if Kitty returns, they'll all have to be so very good to her. Try to remember her family background that set her up for failure, and be gracious. Quote, I will be more loving, more like Christ. I hope he will forgive me for my harshness in the past, end quote. Even though Lady Tranmore never was very harsh with Kitty, she was honestly very patient. It all just sounds like it's being written by someone trying to make Lady Tranmore and Mary look bad, to stoke Kitty's ego. I was so convinced and so confused, and it was only after rereading this section multiple times that I even considered that this might not have been a forged letter. But I don't think it is. I think it's just weird, and I don't know why. Kitty goes to Verona, planning to leave Cliff, but he receives a note, seemingly from Kitty, but in disguised handwriting, telling him to meet her in Verona. We learn that this was almost certainly Mary trying to destroy Ashe's marriage. When he gets to Verona, he's pissed, feeling like she's playing with him, and he shows her the note, and Kitty faints immediately. And then she runs away with him. Something about his presence makes him impossible to resist. They spend the winter, quote, in a wretched village nearly 4,000 feet up, a village of wooden huts with a wooden hospital, end quote. Kitty works as a nurse, she binds wounds and holds people as they die. At first, she and Cliff lived together, but, quote, after the first 2 months, she began to loathe him, and she moved into the hospital to escape him, end quote. He tried to woo her back, but when that didn't work, he got very angry. Quote, he might have behaved to her like the tyrant he is, but that her hold over the people among whom they were living had become greater than his own. They adored her, and Cliff dared not ill-treat her. Sometimes they were more on friendly terms than at others. She would relent and talk as though she loved him, but she would never go back to live with him. He was away more and more, and at last she tells me there was a handsome Bosnian girl, and, well, you can imagine the rest, end quote. Then in March, Kitty became deathly ill, and was brought back to Italy to her sister Alice, where she's been recovering since. She sends a message to Ashe begging that he let her come live at the country house in England near their child's grave. What would it matter? Every doctor thinks she's doomed. But Ashe can't agree to that. He won't divorce her. He'll support her financially. Quote, everything that can be done to protect or ease her shall be done, end quote. But he knows her well enough. She might promise that she won't cause trouble, but she is Kitty, and she will find a way. Ashe's career is his life now, and he needs to protect it. A friend of theirs tries to convince him that if Kitty would endanger his career, maybe he should just quit his dang job. He knew she was trouble when he married her, and yet he vowed, for better or for worse. Maybe he could have done more to guide and protect her. She was so young. She's still very young, by the way. She is 23. I am 23. Ashe is 36. He has an obligation to the soul he vowed to cherish. She is pleading for forgiveness, and if Ashe can't give that to her, she will go to her grave in despair. But he just can't. And this is where this book's relationship with religion comes back. It's been touched on alongside the theme of control. Kitty is wild and uncontrollable. Ashe is a relaxed husband who refuses to be a tyrant. Look at the havoc that ensues. But part of Kitty craves control. Without Ashe, she may have turned to religion, and maybe been better for it, but any faith that she had, quote, was gone before we had been a month married. William killed it, laughed it all out of me, and now, of course, I know there's nothing in it, end quote. Now that she's apart from him and with her sister, she starts going to Mass again. She is repentant. The man telling Ashe to quit his job and uphold his marriage vows is a Christian minister, and I get the feeling that his view is the one that the author sympathizes with the most. I can't prove that. But he argues that if there is the narrowest foothold for love and forgiveness within a marriage, these things are demanded from a Christian, never penalty and hate. And even if Ashe isn't a man of faith, he should abide by the contract he swore to uphold. And the minister is very disappointed when Ashe says no. Cliff is then found stabbed to death in Venice, assassinated by men hired by his actress lover, Mademoiselle Ricci. Kitty attends his funeral and thinks, quote, he had been killed by a jealous woman because of his supposed love for another woman whose abhorrence, in truth, he had earned in a few short weeks. There was something absurd mingled with the horror, as though one watched the prank of a demon, end quote. And then, quote, Kitty vanished like a wraith in the dawn, and the living world of actions and affairs knew her no more, end quote. Ashe, Alice, friends all try to find her, but the closest they get is a bank in Paris, where her allowance from Ashe is still being withdrawn, so she is alive, but a ghost. So Ashe goes back home, back to politics. His passion is dead, but his career is the only thing he has left. In June, he finds himself back abroad, trying to pass through the Alps, when a wild storm washes out the road and leaves him stranded at a local inn for the night. And in the dining room, he recognizes a woman, racked by a wicked cough, who staggers to him with a joyous sob. He takes Kitty upstairs to his room, and they embrace, they kiss, there's crying, quote, agonized murmurs of love, pardon, self-abasement passed between them, end quote. She tells him it's okay, quote, it's all over, you can give me all I want, because I can't live, end quote. He, quote, drew some chairs together before the fire and made a couch for her with pillows and rugs, end quote, and they talk all through the night. Quote, the evening wore on. All the noises ceased downstairs. One by one the guests came up the stone stairs and along the creaking corridor. Boots were thrown out, the doors closed, the strokes of 11 o'clock rang out from the village campanile, and amid the quiet of the now drizzling rain the echoes of the bell lingered on the ear. Soon nothing was heard but the roar of the flooded stream on one side of the old narrow building and the dripping of rain on the other, end quote. She's very casual about the whole situation, very Kitty, but with a more worldly edge. She tells him where she's been and how she's managed, what it was like in Bosnia. She agrees that Ashe was right not to let her back to England. She probably would have caused trouble. He promises never to leave her again, that he'll be taking her to a doctor tomorrow, but as the night wears on, Kitty is fading. She starts hallucinating things that she knows aren't real, describing it like a pleasant sort of fever. At 3 a.m, she suddenly wants to go back to her own room, and Ashe half carries her there. Quote, they entered the little room, which seemed to be in a glory of light, for the sun striking across the low roof of the inn had caught the foamy waterfall beyond, and the reflection of it on the white walls and ceiling was dazzling, end quote. He wants to fetch a doctor, but she asks him just to stay with her instead. But once she's in bed and seems to be sleeping, he goes to get help, and comes back a few minutes later with a woman who works at the inn. Quote, they found Kitty lying on her side, her face hidden entirely in the curls which had fallen across it, and one arm hanging. There was that in her aspect which made them both recoil. Then Ashe rushed to her with a cry, and as he passionately kissed her cold cheek, the voices of others, men and women, began to crowd into the narrow room. The end, end quote. You let her die alone, Ashe. That's a weird way to end things. Let's start with a review from the May 1905 volume of the Bookman magazine. Quote, Mrs. Humphry Ward has always conscientiously held herself aloof from any active intervention in the solution of the problems that her books present. In some respects, The Marriage of William Ashe is as fine a piece of fiction as Mrs. Ward has yet produced, yet it is somewhat puzzling to put into words just what her central problem is. If the attempt must be made, it resolves itself into something like this. To what extent is it the duty of the wife to put aside her personal prejudices and ignore slights and insults for the sake of smoothing her husband's upward course, and to what extent has he the right to control her? Nothing could be better or more convincing than fully 2/3 of the history of this ill-assorted marriage. But when we come to the episode of the satiric novel, when we are asked to believe that she publishes this book with no suspicion that it will seriously disturb him or in any way injure his career, the story ceases to seem altogether plausible. When Kitty, crushed and repentant, is hastening back to rejoin her husband, but suddenly turns and elopes, the story takes on a flavor unpleasantly akin to melodrama. And the final expedient of removing this poor, misguided little woman from her husband's path by killing her off with hasty consumption somehow savors of the wanton and needless cruelty of tearing a butterfly wing from wing. Yet none of this alters the fact that the volume contains a score of admirable portraits, British statesmen, bishops, ladies of rank and quality, drawn with a vividness, a delicate nuance of satire, such as probably no other woman novelist of today could equal. Frederick Tabor Cooper, end quote. This one is interesting, because what I was going to say when I finished reading this book is that I did like how it handled its themes. In my head, I couldn't help comparing this book sometimes to The One Woman, which I did an episode about earlier, partially because it's the only other novel so far that has focused on a marriage rather than a courtship, but also because The One Woman beat you over the head with its messaging like it was a concrete baseball bat. And it made me appreciate that William Ashe touched on a lot of perspectives and thoughts and ideas, and leaned towards some of them, but I think did a good job at showing them genuinely from multiple angles, and seeing through the eyes of whatever character we were following at the time, without the author's opinion bleeding all over it constantly. It's not a lecture, it's an exploration of personalities and ideals and their consequences. There isn't a clear answer to the theme of control, except maybe God. I think Ashe is right that if he kept Kitty on a tighter leash, she would have pushed back all the worse. But it's also suggested that maybe Ashe's inability to get angry is holding him back from becoming a great man. So maybe the answer is he should have been harsher. But Cliff is harsher in some ways, and that didn't work. He and Ashe both went into their relationships with Kitty thinking about how they dreamt of changing her, how they could sculpt her and mold her into grander capacities and powers, and both times that was clearly folly because she does not change. So is there a clear answer? I don't know, and I appreciate that. I found Kitty fascinating. It's interesting to see characters who clearly have some sort of serious mental health issues written in an era where a doctor could just tell you that you've got the madness. She is shown as potentially a nuanced product of both nature and nurture. Madness runs in the family blood, but much of the blame is also placed on her mother's behavior and a bad childhood that leads her to being a person who craves constant adoration and emotional extremes in any direction, whatever she can get. Horrible impulse control, mood swings, and a wild self-centeredness occasionally broken by moments of reflection and self-awareness that go absolutely nowhere. I'm not going to say that she's flawlessly written, but it's a more interesting dissection of psyche than I'm used to from these books. But instead of really getting to see where that path might lead her, either into growth and change or self-imposed tragedy, we took the much simpler route of just killing her off with misery-induced consumption. And I think that was a waste. I think she dies, but it's fine because she's happy about it, and now Ashe is free with no consequences, is the least interesting ending I could think of. I also agree with the reviewer that I think there was a strong point in the general cast of characters. There was a variety of different kinds of people, sometimes painted in very few strokes, but they were still clear and convincing and distinct. And they had their own motives and ways of looking at the world that made sense and I believed and made them feel more realized. Physically, it felt like everyone but Kitty and Ashe was not good looking. Lady Grossville is stiffly erect, her profile said by some to be like a horse, with long-fingered, ugly yet distinguished hands. Cliff has a strange face, and certainly no handsomeness of any accepted kind. My favorite was a random, disheveled, gray-haired gentleman, short in stature, round in figure, something, in short, like an animated egg. Meanwhile, Ashe is literally compared to a Greek statue, and even the people who dislike him insult him by calling him floridly handsome. He is just too handsome. For a book that is mostly people in rooms talking about stuff, I think it did that fairly well. Relationships and emotions between different people were interesting. Some conversations were repetitive. It was probably longer than it needed to be. But the dialogue itself, I felt, was really clearly conveyed. Expressions and posture and body language, that was really clear to visualize and did feel like it added depth to the character's thoughts and state of mind. Also, the levels of polite society snark and subtle shit-talking, terrifying. My worst nightmare. Well done. This sounds like a lot of praise. I didn't love this book, but it felt a lot more solid than a lot of them have, which in turn may have made it less fun to talk about than the more ridiculous ones, but hey. I have one more thing, and then I'm gonna shut up. Do you remember Kitty's horrible dog at the beginning that she wanted to bring to the dinner table? His name is Ponto, and he comes back a couple times over the years, always because Kitty or Ashe is feeding him at the dinner table. Ashe once, quote, settled down to his solitary dinner, but in the middle of it put down Kitty's Aberdeen Terrier, which, for want of other company, he was stuffing atrociously, end quote. Or, in front of the Prime Minister, Kitty is, quote, dipping a biscuit in milk and teasing her small dog with it. Then Kitty's lip twitched. She fed Ponto hastily with all possible cakes, end quote. I just find it charming when people are silly with their dogs across all generations. I, too, would stuff Ponto with all possible cakes. On that note, I'm done. But I hope I'll catch you in the next one, and in the meantime you can catch me at YobbPod, YobbPod, on all the social media places, and Gmail. And for today's life advice from the past, if you propose to someone, and their response is, I am going to ruin your life, I have a terrible temper and no self-control, you cannot, under any circumstances, fix them.